Hey, step away from that vehicle right now. The voice came sharp from behind me, loud enough to make me smack my head on the inside of the SUV's rear hatch. I turned around holding a dusty toolbox in one hand and an old grocery bag in the other, and standing halfway down the driveway was a woman I'd never seen before, pointing her phone at me like she had just caught America's Most Wanted in the middle of a crime. "I already called the police," she said, almost proud of it. "You people always think nobody's watching." And I swear, for a second, I honestly thought she was joking. Because there I was, sweaty, covered in cobwebs, helping a 78-year-old man clean out the back of his own car on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a quiet neighborhood in Asheville, North Carolina. Not exactly the crime of the century. Now, if you had walked by that driveway cold, without context, maybe I can admit it did look a little strange. The SUV was old, one of those faded green Ford Explorers from the early 2000s, paint peeling off the bumper, leaves stuck under the windshield wipers like it hadn't moved in years. The rear hatch was open, and I was halfway inside the cargo area pulling out boxes full of junk while tossing things into a plastic storage bin beside me. Old tools, stained blankets, expired coupons, loose batteries, rusted extension cords. Honestly, it looked less like a car and more like somebody's attic exploded into the back seat. But none of that mattered to the woman across the street. To her, all she saw was a younger guy digging through somebody else's vehicle in broad daylight. And the crazy part is, if she had just waited maybe 10 more seconds, she would have seen Walter. Walter Grayson lived alone in the little white house behind the driveway. Tiny place, crooked porch swing, wind chimes that never stopped rattling. I'd met him about 6 months earlier at Mercer's Hardware, where I worked part-time after getting laid off from my construction job. Walter used to come in every Thursday morning right when we opened, always buying one tiny thing he probably didn't need, just so he could stand around and talk to people. Some folks get lonely in ways that don't look dramatic. They just start stretching simple conversations longer because silence at home feels too heavy. That's how we became friends. At first it was small stuff. Helping him carry birdseed to his truck. Replacing a busted porch light. Once I fixed his mailbox after some teenagers clipped it with their side mirror late one night. He always tried to pay me too much, and I always argued with him about it. Became kind of our thing. A week before all this happened, Walter came into the store slower than usual. His hands were shaking, and he looked exhausted. He leaned on the counter and said, "Ethan, you ever look at a mess long enough that eventually your brain just decides to pretend it ain't there anymore?" I laughed and said, "Every morning when I check my bank account." He chuckled at that, but then his face changed. "That old Explorer out there, I haven't cleaned it in maybe 4 years. Started tossing things in the back after my wife passed. And now every time I open it, I just close it again." That hit me harder than I expected. See, Walter's wife, June, had died 3 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. Everybody in the neighborhood knew about it because before she got sick, their house was the kind of place where people gathered. Christmas lights every winter, cookouts during football season, music playing on the porch. After she died, all of it stopped. Walter still existed, but it felt like half the life around him disappeared. So I told him I'd come by Saturday and help clean the SUV out. Simple as that. Saturday afternoon rolled around hot as hell. One of those humid Carolina days where your shirt sticks to your back 5 minutes after stepping outside. Walter sat on the porch mostly watching while I worked through years of accumulated junk. Every object seemed attached to some memory. There were maps from road trips he and June used to take through Tennessee, old cassette tapes labeled in faded marker, a broken Polaroid camera wrapped in a towel. At one point, Walter picked up a little plastic dinosaur from under the seat and stared at it for a solid minute before quietly saying, "My grandson left that in there in 2011. I remember thinking how strange grief really is. Sometimes it hides inside tiny, meaningless objects nobody else would ever notice. About 40 minutes into cleaning, I started hearing the wind chimes going crazy behind me. Not from the wind, from movement. That's when I noticed the woman across the street, standing at the edge of her lawn, staring directly at me. Mid-50s maybe, expensive sunglasses, phone in hand, expression already halfway convinced of something terrible. Walter noticed her too and muttered under his breath, "Oh boy, that's Linda Kessler." Now the way he said her name told me everything before he even explained it. Every neighborhood has one person who acts like they were elected sheriff without anybody voting. Linda apparently monitored everything. packages left too long on porches, cars parked slightly over the curb, trash cans visible after pickup day. Walter once told me she reported a teenager because his garage band practiced after 8 p.m. on a Friday. At first I ignored her, figured she'd get bored eventually. Instead, she lifted her phone higher and started recording me. And that's when the whole afternoon started turning into something else entirely. I remember looking over at Walter like, "You seeing this too?" And he just sighed the way tired old men do when they've already lived through enough nonsense to recognize where things are headed before everyone else catches up. He leaned back slowly in his porch chair, rubbing one hand against his knee, and said, "Linda's been waiting for a reason to bother somebody since the Nixon administration." That actually made me laugh. But Linda didn't laugh. She started walking toward the driveway with this determined little stride like she was about to uncover a major criminal operation instead of two guys sorting through expired jumper cables and grocery receipts. The closer she got, the more dramatic she became. Phone up, chin high, narrating everything into the camera like she was filming a documentary. "Yes, this is exactly what I was talking about," she said into her phone. Young male, approximately 30 years old, removing property from a vehicle. The homeowner appears elderly, possibly being taken advantage of. I actually looked behind me for a second because the way she said it made it sound like there was another guy there committing felonies while I somehow missed it. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He asked me to help him. She ignored me completely. "Sir," she called to Walter instead, suddenly using this fake sweet voice people use when they think old age automatically means confusion. "Do you know this man?" Walter blinked at her slowly. Well, I'd sure hope so considering I invited him over. That should have ended it right there. Any normal person would have realized they misunderstood the situation and moved on with their day. Maybe even laughed about it. But Linda wasn't interested in being wrong. You could actually see it on her face, that stubborn little tightening around her mouth when reality refuses to cooperate with whatever story somebody already decided to believe. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Well, maybe you trust him," she said, looking directly at me now. "But older people get manipulated all the time." There was something about the way she said older people that bothered me. Not concern, not compassion. It sounded more like ownership, like she believed everyone else in the neighborhood needed her supervision. Walter's eyes narrowed a little. "Linda, the boy's helping me clean my car." "The boy," she repeated with this dry little laugh. "Walter, you don't know what people are capable of these days." That sentence hung in the air weirdly long. And maybe I'm reading too much into it now looking back, but there was definitely something underneath it. Something beyond concern for an elderly neighbor. The way she kept staring at me, analyzing me, taking inventory of my clothes, my beard, the tattoos on my forearm from my construction years. It felt less like she thought I was stealing and more like she had already decided I belonged to the category of people who probably steal. I've run into that before. Not because I'm some hardened-looking guy, but because life hasn't exactly wrapped me in polished packaging. I'm 6'2", broad shoulders, usually wearing work boots and old jeans, and after getting laid off, I let my hair grow out longer than I probably should have. There are certain people who see a man like that and instantly start filling in blanks with whatever fears they already carry around. Still, I kept my mouth shut, because Walter mattered more than my pride. I went back to cleaning while Linda stood there watching for another minute before finally turning around. But instead of going home, she stopped at the sidewalk across the street and stayed there, watching, phone still in her hand. "You know she's calling somebody," Walter muttered. I figured. She used to be head of the HOA before they dissolved it. That explained everything. About 15 minutes later, I was pulling an old cooler from the back seat when I heard tires rolling slowly down the street. Police cruiser. Right on schedule. Now here's the thing people don't always understand unless they've been in that situation before. Even when you know you've done absolutely nothing wrong, seeing a police car pull up because somebody reported you still does something to your nervous system. Your body doesn't wait for logic. Heart rate jumps immediately. Thoughts start racing. You replay every movement you made wondering how it looked from somebody else's angle. The cruiser stopped in front of the driveway, and this younger officer stepped out, probably mid-30s, clean haircut, sunglasses reflecting the sunlight. Calm guy. Didn't come in aggressive or anything. But the second he looked at me standing beside that open SUV, then looked at the pile of stuff on the driveway, then spotted Linda standing across the street with her arms folded like she'd just solved a murder case. I could tell he was already trying to piece together 3 different versions of the story. He walked up slowly. "Afternoon," he said. "Hey," I answered. "You mind stepping away from the vehicle for me a second?" Now, technically, he asked politely, but everybody knows that's not really a request. So I stepped back. Walter started trying to stand from his chair too fast and nearly lost his balance. Instinctively, I moved toward him to help, but the officer lifted one hand slightly. "Sir, just hang on one second. That right there, that bothered me more than anything else all day. Not because the officer was rude. He wasn't. He was just being cautious. But there's something deeply frustrating about suddenly feeling suspicious in a moment where you were genuinely trying to help somebody." The officer looked at me first. "This your vehicle?" "No, sir." "You have identification on you?" "Yeah." I handed him my wallet while Linda watched from across the street like she was waiting for dramatic background music to kick in. The officer glanced at my ID. "You live around here?" "About 15 minutes away." "And what exactly are you doing today?" Before I could answer, Linda shouted from across the street. "I told dispatch he was removing property from the car." The officer didn't even turn toward her. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." But you could tell she loved every second of it. I explained everything calmly. Told him about Walter, about helping clean the SUV, about the stuff piling up over the years. While I was talking, Walter finally made it down the porch steps using the railing for support. Slow, painful movement. The kind older people try to hide because they don't want anyone seeing how much effort basic things take now. "Officer," Walter said, breathing a little hard, "he's telling the truth." The officer shifted his attention immediately. "Sir, this is your vehicle? Had it since 2002. And you asked him to help you clean it out?" "Yes, sir." That should have wrapped things up neatly. But then something happened I honestly still think about sometimes. Linda crossed the street again. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Confident. And she said, "Well, how was anyone supposed to know that? All I saw was some man digging through an old person's car." Some man. Funny how people say phrases like that when they want to distance somebody from basic humanity. I saw the officer's jaw tighten just slightly. Tiny reaction, but enough. Walter looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Linda, you could have just asked me." Simple sentence. Quiet. But it landed harder than yelling ever could have. For the first time all afternoon, Linda looked uncomfortable. Not guilty exactly. More irritated that things weren't unfolding the way she imagined. "Well," she said defensively, "people have to look out for each other nowadays." And honestly, that's the part where things got complicated in my head. Because technically, she wasn't entirely wrong. There really are scams targeting elderly people. There really are situations where neighbors should step in. If this had been an actual theft and she ignored it, people probably would have criticized her for staying silent. But there's a difference between concern and performance. Concern asks questions first. Performance jumps straight to accusation because being the hero feels better than being the neighbor. The officer handed me my ID back and nodded once. "All right, looks like we're good here." I thought that was the end of it. Then Walter said something nobody expected. "Officer, would you mind helping me settle a little debate?" The officer paused. "Depends what kind of debate." Walter pointed toward the open SUV. "You think this mess looks more like a robbery, or a man who's been too lonely to throw things away?" And suddenly the whole mood changed. For a second nobody said anything. The officer glanced into the back of the Explorer again, really looking this time instead of scanning it like part of a routine call. And once you actually paid attention, the story inside that vehicle became obvious. Nothing valuable had been separated. Nothing organized like somebody trying to steal it. It was just years of life piled on top of grief. Fast food napkins shoved beside unopened mail, old fishing gear tangled with pharmacy receipts, cassette tapes sliding around under lawn tools. The kind of mess that happens slowly when a person stops having anyone around to notice it growing. The officer took off his sunglasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Honestly," he said quietly, "looks like somebody's been carrying a heavy load for a long time." Walter gave this little nod like somebody had finally translated a language he'd been speaking silently for years. Linda crossed her arms tighter. "Well, excuse me for caring." But even she sounded less certain now. Walter looked over at her and said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "Caring starts with conversation, Linda, not suspicion." That hit harder than if he'd screamed at her. You gotta understand, Walter wasn't some fiery confrontational guy. He was patient to a fault. The kind of man who apologized to furniture after bumping into it. So hearing disappointment in his voice carried weight. And for the first time all afternoon, Linda didn't have a quick response ready. The officer cleared his throat awkwardly, probably realizing he had just accidentally wandered into 30 years of neighborhood tension. "Well," he said carefully, "I'm glad everything checked out." Then he surprised me. He pointed toward the pile of junk beside the driveway. "Need another set of hands?" I laughed. "You serious?" He shrugged. "Dispatch already thinks I'm here solving crimes." Even Walter cracked up at that. And just like that, the tension broke. The three of us spent the next 20 minutes sorting through the rest of the SUV while Linda stood awkwardly near the sidewalk pretending to check messages on her phone. At one point, the officer held up this ancient GPS unit covered in dust and said, "Man, this thing probably still thinks Blockbuster exists." Walter laughed so hard he started coughing. That moment right there, weirdly enough, became my favorite part of the whole day. Because for the first time since June died, I think Walter felt like part of the world again instead of somebody watching it from the porch. People don't realize how loneliness accumulates. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like unopened boxes, unwashed coffee mugs, a vehicle full of things nobody had enough energy to deal with. While we cleaned, Walter started telling stories connected to random objects we found. A cracked flashlight from a camping trip in 1998. A Braves baseball cap June bought him because she said his old one made him look like a divorced raccoon. An old diner receipt from Tennessee where they got stranded during a rainstorm and ended up dancing under the awning because the power went out inside. Every object had fingerprints on it emotionally. That SUV wasn't clutter. It was evidence of a life continuing after the person you built it with disappears. Eventually, we reached the very back corner underneath an old blanket, and Walter suddenly went quiet. "What's that?" I asked. He stared for a second before slowly lifting out a small cardboard box sealed with faded tape. "Oh," he whispered. "Just the kind of that already carries tears inside it." He sat down carefully on the porch step and opened the box with shaky hands. Inside were dozens of old photographs. Actual printed photographs, edges curling slightly with age. Him and June at Niagara Falls. Christmas mornings. Backyard cookouts. One picture from the early 80s where Walter had this giant mustache that honestly deserved its own zip code. The officer leaned over my shoulder. "That mustache is criminal." Walter laughed through wet eyes. June hated it too. Then he stopped on one picture longer than the others. It showed June sitting in the passenger seat of that same Explorer, smiling at whoever took the photo. "You know what the worst part about losing somebody is?" Walter asked quietly without looking up. None of us answered. "It's not the big moments. It's realizing one day nobody else remembers the small ones but you." Man, that sentence just settled over the whole driveway. Even Linda looked affected by it from across the street. A few minutes later, the officer got called away on another dispatch and headed back to his cruiser. Before leaving, he shook my hand and said quietly, "Sorry about the misunderstanding." I told him it wasn't his fault. Because honestly, it wasn't. He was doing his job based on the information he received. And weirdly enough, I respected the way he handled it once he saw the full picture. But Linda, that was different. She stayed outside after the cruiser pulled away, pacing near her mailbox like she wanted to say something, but couldn't decide whether pride would let her. Finally, she walked halfway across the street again. Walter looked up at her calmly, and she said, "I was only trying to protect you." Now, depending on who's listening to this story, that sentence probably lands differently. Some people will hear sincerity. Others will hear ego trying to disguise itself after getting embarrassed. Truthfully, I think it was both. Walter stood there slowly, one hand resting on the open hatch of the SUV. The afternoon sun was starting to dip lower behind the houses, and for a second the whole street looked strangely peaceful compared to the chaos from earlier. Then he said, "Linda, when June got sick, people brought casseroles for about 2 weeks. After the funeral, everybody disappeared little by little. That's how it goes, I guess. Folks move on with their lives." He paused. "Ethan here helped me more in 6 months than most people around me have in 3 years." Linda's face changed immediately. Not angry this time. Ashamed. And suddenly I realized something maybe she hadn't admitted even to herself yet. Maybe this wasn't entirely about suspicion. Maybe watching a stranger help Walter forced her to confront the fact she'd spent years monitoring the neighborhood without really participating in it. There's a difference. A huge difference. Watching people isn't the same as caring for them. She looked at Walter for a long moment and quietly said, "I didn't know you needed help." Walter smiled sadly. "That's because you never asked." And there it was. The real ending to the whole thing. Not the police. Not the accusation. Not even the misunderstanding. Just that sentence. "You never asked." Linda nodded once, almost to herself, then turned and walked back across the street slower than before. No dramatic apology. No movie-style redemption speech. Just silence and reflection. Honestly, that felt more real. After she went inside, Walter and I finished cleaning the Explorer as the sun disappeared behind the trees. By the end of it, the whole back of the SUV was empty for the first time in years. Walter stood there staring into the clean cargo space like he was looking at a room inside himself he'd finally opened again. Then he said something that stuck with me all the way home. "You know what's funny, Ethan? People think getting old is mostly about your body falling apart." He tapped the side of the SUV gently. "But mostly, it's watching the world slowly stop noticing you." I didn't know what to say to that. Because deep down, I think a lot of people already feel invisible long before old age ever arrives. Now here's why this story still bothers me a little even years later. Because I honestly can't decide whether Linda was wrong. That's the uncomfortable part. If she truly believed an elderly man was being robbed and stayed silent, that would have been terrible too. Communities should look out for vulnerable people. Neighbors should care when something feels off. But somewhere along the line, a lot of us stopped starting with curiosity and jumped straight into suspicion instead. We record strangers before speaking to them. We assume intent before asking questions. And once people decide somebody looks suspicious, confirmation bias does the rest. I think about that a lot now. Especially because if Walter hadn't walked out when he did, that entire situation could have gone very differently. So I want to ask you something honestly. If you had looked out your window and seen me digging through that old SUV, what would you have assumed? Would you have walked over and asked questions first? Or would you have called the police too? And more importantly, at what point did helping each other start looking suspicious in the first place? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely think people are going to be divided on this one.